Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's program and webinar presented by the Association of Continuity Professionals. I'm Jim Brennan, and it's my pleasure to host our webinar today, Deciphering Overlapping Standards and Requirements Using the BCP Genome. And we will begin after a couple of quick reminders. We want to let you know that this webinar, as are all our previous webinars, recorded and then made available to our ACP members on the ACP website. If you have an idea for a webinar topic, please let us know about it. Send it to staff@acp-international.com. And our guest speaker today will be taking questions, so please post your questions during the webinar in the question box in your control panel throughout the presentation. They will be answered at the end of the webinar. Any questions that are not answered here today will be given to the presenter. He will compose some answers and get them right out to you. So we appreciate you remembering that. Our webinar today, as I said, Deciphering Overlapping Standards and Requirements Using the BCP Genome. And why would you focus on just one standard when you could comply with any or all of them? Today we'll be discovering a better way to interpret the alphabet soup of ISO, FF, IEC, NFPA, NASD, DRI, BCI, all the other ones. And we'll discuss them in a way that will really be an advantage to you. This webinar discusses the strategies behind the BCP Genome Framework and how to approach and can help you develop more practical and thorough business continuity plans. So enough from me. Let's turn to our presenter, who is Frank Perlmutter, founder and president of Strategic BCP. Frank's been an outspoken advocate for BCDR professionals for more than 20 years. He's a former manager of DR, Continuity of Operations at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, also senior IT consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers and Ernst & Young. And it is with great pleasure that we welcome Frank Perlmutter. Frank, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Jim. I'm excited to present today on the genome, and thank you everybody for taking an hour out of your day to spend learning about the genome and how you can develop your own business continuity gold standard, which can help you do actually a number of things, as Jim discussed. So here's a bit of our topics for today. We're going to be going over the differences among what a regulation standard and a best practice is. Really important for developing the strategic BCP genome, and also for you for developing your own gold standard. How did we do it? The time commitment, and also all the resources that were required. So we learned a lot during that process, and it'll really help you a lot to skip over a lot of the mistakes I think that we made over the years. It's been in existence now for 11 years, and we've constantly evolved it too. So there's been a lot of things that we've learned in the initial setup and also in the ongoing update of the strategic BCP genome. As Jim mentioned, there are a ton of regulations, standards, best practices. Which one do you follow? Or I should say, which ones do you follow on there? We're going to go through some of them today. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to go through all of them, but I will talk about several of them specifically and which ones can help you the most and are the most relevant to developing your own structure and gold standard. We'll go over some implementation options, and then at the end, as Jim mentioned, we'll do Q&A and wrap up. So the goals for today's webinar are to, first, as I mentioned on there, apply lessons from how we map the genome as the gold standard so that you can help develop your own. We're going to look at, as I mentioned, some of the specific standards, regs, and best practices. And we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses. And I think there's always a couple that people are surprised about, and they say, my gosh, that's not really good to help me do a BIA or to help me with my emergency operations planning, with crisis management, or with DR. And we really, when you dig into a lot of these, sometimes there's a lot of fluff in there. And it's getting by that extra stuff to really get to the meat of each of the different standards, regulations, and best practices. So we'll tell you, we'll decipher those for you and tell you which ones are good and which ones are maybe not so good. And we'll offer some other useful methodologies, tools, resources for information so that you can implement your gold standard. We'll show you some shortcuts in that. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is what's the difference in between a regulation standard and a best practice, and why does that matter? Okay, so regulations, you can see here's the definition of that. They are mandatory. That is the key word right here, mandatory, authoritative rules. You have to do them, okay? They're issued by an authority of government and industry. You can see on here, here's a couple of examples. I won't discuss those specifically yet. We're going to talk a lot about what those standards and best practices, regs, all the different types and the specific ones a little later in the webinar. And you can see that standards and best practices, voluntary, mandatory, have to do, voluntary, you can do if you want to do, okay? And notice just some of the examples that are here, some of the examples that are here, okay? We're going to talk a lot about that today. So why do I care about this? So why do I care about regulations? You have to do them. They mandate, they require compliance. If you are an organization which is under those regulations where you have to do that compliance in financial services, healthcare, utilities, and then there's a number of different regulations that span across different industries too that are requiring policies on privacy, on IT security, and the business continuity programs and the plans that support those. Those are mandatory too. There are penalties if you choose not to comply. You also have internal compliance too, so you are compelled, not obligated. There aren't any penalties, but a lot of times those can be just as bad. Your company has policy requirements. You may have an internal audit department on there. So the big thing is a lot of people say, well, I'm not sure, do I really have to do those? Well, if not, the auditors, you can ask them up front, or they will certainly tell you. So you may have, two of the companies that I worked for in my past with Price Waterhouse and with Ernst & Young, they'll tell you your external auditors on there. You may have those internal auditors. You have to do those, okay? So it's important to know if your program and your plans are going to comply with those. Standards, okay, the standards on there, the best practices. So guidance, that's really important too. You want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. So standards, regulations, best practices, they can provide guidance, and it's along the complete continuum of your business continuity program. So how do you initiate that? Your governance around that particular program, budgeting, policies and procedures. Secondly, they provide a process for developing it and delivering it. So there's different parts in there. That BIA part, the IT plans, okay, your business recovery plans, your call trees, communications plans, all those items in there, they establish that process for doing that. How to manage it, how to monitor it, how to oversee and to deliver metrics on how well you're doing as a program. There's a lot of that, especially in a lot of those ISO standards. So we'll talk about that. And then how do you audit it? So here's an example right now of how you can audit your program. You can use your gold standard and you say, how well do I align? How well do I conform to the standards? And how well do I comply to those different regulations? So here's the thing. This is the one of the lessons learned as we were developing the business continuity genome, and something that we see time and time again. You'll say, do I use 10 standards? Do I use 2 standards? Do I use 20 standards? Do I use 100 standards? So there's a ton of standards, best practices, regulations on there. What you want to start with is you want to start with the things that you have to do. We only have so much time in a day. We want to make sure that we at least start with those. Once you get those down, you can move on to the things that you may want to conform with or align to. Regulations take priority, and then the standards and those best practices come later. That's why we care about those certain items, but we have to prioritize which ones are most important to utilize and to follow within our programs and within our plans. Okay. So that's a bit of the background on those different items on there. So now what I'm going to talk about is a bit about how we built the strategic BCP genome, and I'm going to tell you where it is today and some of the things that we learned from that. So back in 2006, we started what we called the Genome Project. And the goal of that project was to develop a gold standard structure based on the business continuity industry's collective thought leadership. So we thought ourselves to be pretty smart people here at Strategic BCP, but we realized, hey, it wasn't the world according to us. We wanted to go out into the industry and take all of that knowledge, the best standards, regs, best practices, and we wanted to look at them and see how we could take them and put them together to come up with a gold standard. And that gold standard, so we called the Strategic BCP Genome. So the way that we looked for those particular standards and best practices and regulations was we wanted to look at the content. Okay, so regardless of industry popularity, you know, people were saying, oh, you should look at this or the other thing. We went in and we wanted to look at the content of those. And the rule of thumb was, you know what, everybody here at Strategic BCP, the folks that were looking at this and helping us out, don't interpret those standards. It's not the world according to you. We wanted to synthesize them, take them collectively together, and what we want to do is we want to summarize them in points of good business continuity planning, okay? And that's expanded out into a number of different areas too, into risk management, out into disaster recovery, into cybersecurity. But originally back in 2006, those weren't topics that the business continuity profession was talking about. But they are extremely relevant today, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on too. But you can see the biggest thing was we wanted to take all of that together. So we started with 9 standards, regulations, and best practices. That established the original structure. And we went point by point through each of those. And what we did was we mapped each of the different requirements from those different standards, and we mapped them into 101 points of, like I said, of strong business continuity planning, okay? And then what we did was after about 4 of those standards, we had our structure. It was the core structure. The reason why we had it after only 4 of those was because there was a ton of redundancy across all of these different items. So as we went on in and we looked at like an NFPA 1600 and we went into the FFIEC BCP work program and we were looking at all of these different items on there, what we were noticing was that they were all saying very similar things, or they were saying exactly the same things. That was great news for us, okay? Because what we saw, you can see here, was that the remaining 5 were 95% redundant to the original points that we mapped. We originally mapped 101 points. So it was everything from like, this is the way that a business continuity policy should be. This is the way that you should structure a DR plan. This is the way that you should structure a communications plan. So you get the idea on there. And it was great because we were all saying the same things, and we refined those points as we kept on adding standards, best practices, and the regulations in there. So you can see here at the end, we mapped those 101 points to 8 major categories. What you'll notice on this slide is that we additionally have 9, 10, and 11 here. Anything with a star on here is new, okay? So we've added this. This wasn't a part of the original standard. So you can see here, cybersecurity, IT risk management, third-party or vendor risk management, and then you see up here too, operational risk management, which many times is a synonym to that business impact analysis on there. There are some additional items on here. That is actually, we've expanded out to 120 now. Those include those additional starred items on here. So within the first 8 items, and I'm going to go through what those are right now, they establish those core areas of the genome. So what is program organization, management, and training? Okay. Program organization, management, and training is all of the governance around how you're building your business continuity program, all right? So things like establishing your steering committee, your governance policy, your budgeting, the resources for your planning. What type of team should you have? How many resources should be on that team? What are their responsibilities? So you get the idea on here. Just like an overall project, this is what the program for business continuity, these are the different items that they, your assumptions, your overall procedures that are going into those plans and into that program. That's what's in there. Management, so that's the reporting, how you're reporting up to your management or up to that board level, and then obviously the training too. So how are you disseminating the business continuity program across the organization and making sure that folks are competent in what you've included in there? So that's a real big chunk of what a lot of the standards have covered on there. So it's interesting. We'll talk a lot about that, especially around ISO 22301. That is a huge focus of that standard. So it's all of the context around our business continuity programs. The second one is business impact analysis. I'll talk a little bit about operational risk management too. So everybody knows the BIA. There was relatively little around the business impact analysis when we first started out. So everybody said that you had to do a business impact analysis, and then we said, all right, well, how are we supposed to do this? And not much there. That has changed over the years. ISO 22317 has helped to supplement that, but there's still, I think, a ways to go on how you're doing that BIA and those consistent procedures of implementation across that. Operational risk management, there is a big crux of looking at normal business operations across a lot of the different risk management standards. And in some of the business continuity regulations and the standards and best practices too, there's a core axiom in there that says, if you don't understand how you normally operate, how can you really develop your recovery plans? So that's big. They say, hey, you should really be understanding how you normally operate before you're developing those recovery plans. When you're looking at items, especially COSO, which we actually do a webinar on around risk management, that is a core focus on understanding risks through understanding your operations. It's actually really very, very helpful and really should drive a lot of the business continuity planning. So those items have been added in later on into that genome. But I would really encourage you to take a look at that because that's really the crux of a lot of what we're doing in our business continuity planning. The third area is emergency response and crisis management. How are we making decisions on the onset of an event? And it's always called different items: event, incident, outage, disaster. Lots of different terminology. That's very challenging across all the different standards, regs, and best practices. We're calling things different terms on there. So look up that glossary first and say, oh, are they talking about what I think they're talking about on here? Some of the things like RTO, MTPD, there are all the different acronyms and everything. Look into that glossary. So I know I don't have it up on the slide here, but that's another big tip too. What are we talking about here? Emergency response can sometimes be called incident response, can sometimes be called crisis management. Sometimes that can be separated too. So sometimes they'll separate that into different sections on there. So overall, how do we initially respond to that particular disaster? What are those different follow-on activities? How do we declare a disaster on there? How do we handle our people and our facilities? What are all those activities around there? So before we're recovering business operations, before we're recovering information technology, we are doing all of these initial activities: emergency response and crisis management. The fourth area, emergency facilities, covers all of the different locations. This is actually a surprisingly big area, and we made it a separate category on there because there was just so much involved with your command center. You know, where are all your decision makers going? Your IT recovery locations and your backup data centers, your user recovery areas, your workspace, all those different areas on there. So emergency facilities is really extremely important on there. There are a number of different standards too that talk about distances, or they make reference to a distance but don't tell you an exact distance that an emergency facility should be from a primary facility or from an operational facility. In the financial services industry, it is always an ongoing topic of conversation on there. So be aware of that too. That may pop up. Some of these points may pop up in certain industries more than others. The fifth point, business and IT disaster recovery. Business recovery, how do you continue to operate without your core infrastructure of IT people and those core assets on there? And then IT disaster recovery, how do you bring back all of your information technology or the critical parts of that IT? So that's talking about things when we look at each of these different areas. Business continuity is talking about each of your recovery playbooks in there. What's the content of some of those? It talks a bit about that. IT disaster recovery, how are you bringing back your applications, your data, your infrastructure, all those different items on there. The NIST 800 series was always particularly good. It started out in 2006 as that. It was actually very interesting. One of the particular industries, the government and the collections industry, brought up the NIST 800-34 standard on there. All collection companies that were doing work for the government and collecting debt had to follow that particular standard. The reason why I bring that up is that a lot of organizations, both government and also your customers, may throw in a standard that you've never seen before. You're going to want to consider that. If your clients say to you, hey, you have to have this standard in place, you should put that in place. I've seen it across a number of different ones where, I tell you, over the course of a number of years where we're like, I don't know what that one is. And we've included that in the particular standards. GTAG comes to mind as a number of years ago. We were like, what exactly is this? And we included that in the business continuity planning genome. The sixth one is testing. Okay, testing, yet another term that's used concurrently, exercising your plans, extremely important on there. Typically that's talking about the types of tests that you may run, suggestions on that, or mandatory type testing, the frequency of those particular exercises on there. So that's in that particular area. Maintenance of plans. Okay, so when we talk about ISO again, how do you maintain them? Okay, how do you keep them up to date? That's where they talk about things like a business continuity management system, another word for business continuity management software. You know, when we're putting our plans, or excuse me, when we're updating our plans, how are we doing that? How are we ensuring that everything that's in those particular documents is actually what exists at our companies? Does it reflect current operations? Does it reflect the current infrastructure? And this has become, this is an interesting one, because when you see an auditor or an examiner go against this, what they'll do is they'll look for particular points in your program, and I always used to go right to the call lists, and I would say, and match it up with an employee roster. Does it match up? And I'd always, invariably, I would find that those people didn't exist at the organization. The incident commander, which you'll find in that emergency response and crisis management, the person who is the head honcho during that disaster, I've actually found where that person is no longer at the organization. As you imagine, that is a huge problem. So making sure that the maintenance is correct on that. How do you audit, and your general policy on there too? It's a little thin in those different standards because there's not really much to it. You know, it's the frequency of that auditing. On there, some methods for doing that too. I'll go into some of the other areas too. Operational risk management is focusing, just like the BIA, on how you're assessing the risk around operations. So not the overall enterprise risk management. And it's interesting because enterprise risk management, you know, where you're doing your typical NFPA 1600, and I'm going way back to the original one where they list out what are your risks or your threats on there, your hazards. and you go through and you say what's the probability and the impact of each of those, what are your mitigation strategies on there. Usually we keep on seeing that broken out separately. Operational risk is looking at each of your different business functions or processes and saying what's the risk in losing that to the overall organization regardless of the particular event. So in other words, if I can't process claims, if I can't conduct classes at my university, if I can't open my lab today and do my studies, what's the impact of those particular areas? And two, the mapping of those particular functions too. Do we understand how we normally do things? That's big. I think that there was, originally there wasn't much about that, about actually understanding normal operations. That is huge right now, especially with the convergence of risk management into that business continuity space. We'll talk a little bit about that later too. I have a later slide on that. We all know what cybersecurity is, and there's a lot of that. It's interesting because now they're sort of combining together the IT disaster recovery. We see that with some of the cybersecurity. IT risk management on there. How are you properly managing the threats around IT? So this is also, we see this combined in a couple of the different standards, best practices, and regs too. And then your third-party vendor risk management. The big one that we all saw was Appendix J in the FFIEC BCP work program. But this is basically for the people that are doing work for you, how are you managing the risk around that? And some of those standards have, and especially the regulations, especially that FFIEC, the examiners have become really, really diligent in assessing that. So in other words, they say, here's your organization, have all of your vendors, have you looked at all of their plans and their business continuity programs? Oh, and by the way, have you looked at the vendor of your vendor? I've even seen it going out to the vendor of the vendor of the vendor. And we call that N2, N3, N4. It's getting a little crazy, but we need to be prepared for that. We want to make sure, so by building that gold standard, we want to make sure that we're prepared for what, like we said, what the auditors are asking us, what the examiners are asking us, what the clients are asking us, and most importantly, being prepared in the event of any type of event, that we are truly resilient in the face of any type of event, outage, disaster, or any of the other glossary terms that they're referring to when the bad stuff happens. So here's a bit about the BCP genome today. So you can see on there, we made an initial investment. It was expensive to start out. We were a small company back then. It took about 10 months to get everything together to basically to synthesize all those different standards, and then we wanted to check it with a number of different folks too. So we did that. That took originally about 10 months. And it stood the test of time. The great part about establishing a gold standard is that the points that we look at with BCP and DR are still really, really similar to the way that they were even a decade ago. And that may seem surprising, but it's not like we've come up with a lot of things that are completely or absolutely different in any of these standards. Some of the guidance has changed, where it's saying, hey, we might have a better way to assess risk appetite, or to do our BIAs, which is great because now that how-to is coming, where it was just, here's what you need to do before. The new areas where we're seeing changes is in the new areas like we talked about of the op risk, of IT risk, third party, and the cybersecurity. So we went from 101 to 120 points on there. But the great part about this is that as a company, for us, it still guides the continuous refinement and really the core of the software that we sell, of how we do our audits, of our consulting practice, and additionally, too, of how we run our business continuity program. It is essential to understand what we need to do before we do it. So in other words, we couldn't just build software. We couldn't just do audits. We couldn't just run our programs unless we knew what we wanted to comply with, what we wanted to conform to, and what we wanted to align to. So it's all of those things. So it's been extremely helpful. Okay, so some of the lessons learned along the way. So I've talked a bit about some of those already on there. So let's see what some of the other ones are too. Okay, So the first thing is how can you do it yourselves on here? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned through these steps too. So as I mentioned before, start with regulations and your client requirements. So that's the very first thing on there. The voluntary stuff, you can do that in step 2. So step 1, regs, internal client requirements. Step 2, determine the areas that you want to address on there, and determine the areas in step 3 that you want to enhance, okay? So when you're going in, you go back to those 11 different areas right now, where do you think you're weak on there? Do you think maybe you need a better policy? Do you think maybe you need to do your BIA a little bit better? Or maybe IT, disaster recovery planning, has been lacking on there. Determine those areas on there. Determine if you want to enhance your current structure, and then select the best standards, regulations, and best practices. So the next question, so you're thinking right now, what exactly is that? Is there a standard that's really good with ITDR? Is there a best practice that's really good overall at just sort of setting the governance stage and for me doing a program? You know, I'm just starting out here. The company doesn't have anything. I want to start out. Or, hey, I'm doing really, really well. I do everything fantastically. Maybe there's some areas where I might want to refine. I want to go into some of those risk management areas. And you say, oh, you know what? Wait, you mentioned that COSO standard, or maybe COBIT, or maybe ISO 31000, risk management standards. And they're providing some of the more sophisticated areas that a lot of business continuity professionals are getting into. The last thing that we want to do is we want to map them to a consistent structure. So that structure, each of those different points. So you write down and you say, so we would say point 1, business continuity policy. A business continuity policy should have so on and so forth in there. A BIA should start with establishing our impact factors, next establish our time frames, and then assess impact over a time continuum. So actually I'm quoting from some of the requirements that we have on there. Those are the things that you can see from each of those different areas on there. And I'm going to go over specific ones too that we have within our Genome, help you out a bit. Okay. So one of the biggest things that we look for, as I mentioned before, was practical guidance. Now that can be difficult to find sometimes. So many of the standards focus on policies and procedures, not program content. So how do I set it up? And I go, okay, that's great, but now how do I, once I've set it up, how do I build it? So I call that structure bread and structure meat, okay? You can call that, I don't know if I want to call that, I called it fluff a little bit earlier. That might have been a little bit of a harsh term. We'll call it bread for now. How about fluffy bread? We'll do that. Program organization, management, and training. Setup. When I'm done, how do I maintain it? How do I audit it? What's the general policy? There is a ton of content on this, and some standards primarily focus on the structure bread. It's all this. And isn't that a shame? Because a lot of the big standards out there, like the ones that we originally thought, and even today, that we thought, this is going to be fantastic. I'm going to be able to really drive my program and make it better by going into these different, you know, I dig into the standard, I finish it up, and I go, where's all this stuff? Where's the meat? The business impact analysis. Where is that? In a lot of these different standards, what you'll see is you'll see referential items. That's a big thing in building standards. Okay, when I was with the Treasury Department, I also used to do EDI, and we would build standards in our work group on there. And there was a lot of this. And I was like, well, how do we build that EDI standard? What are the different points where we're sending, an EDI 835 on there? What are the different fields? How do we do those different things? And we gotta, I think that's almost problematic across a lot of different industries. So the big thing is I'm going to tell you today some of the ones that have a lot of the really good content in there. So when you're looking and you're doing that BIA, okay, when you're doing the emergency response and crisis management, so you can see as most of the areas on here is that structure meet, there's some really good places where you can look on there. So I'll go over that. Actually, I have a slide all on the original standards that we looked at, and also tell you a bit about where to look a little later on. Okay, actually not a little later on, actually here's the slide right here. So we can see here, we have a ton out there. So focus on this, I couldn't fit 100 on here, so many more. I probably could have fit in a couple more minis on here to talk about that. But let's go over a couple of standards, regs, and best practices and what they are. Invariably, whenever I do the webinar, when I do this presentation, people say, "Hey, you forgot this one." Oh, I didn't forget it. I just couldn't fit it on here, and we obviously don't have a lot of time to talk about that. If you do have a question on any of the particular standards, regs, or best practices, definitely feel free to email us. We probably looked at it before. It's probably in the Genome. As I mentioned before, the Genome has 30 standards. They're actually on our website on there. So obviously you can see they're not all, I haven't listed them all on here. But I wanted to put these on here just as some examples and make some points about them. So our favorite one, ISO 22301, on here, that's the standard that a lot of people talk about. We audit against it. We become certified auditors against it and everything. ISO 22301, which I'll talk about, that has a lot of the bread in there. That is a highly referential standard that says maybe you might want to look at ISO 22313. That's a good one. 22313, a lot of content in there. 22317, BIA standard on there. ISO 31000, risk management. And I believe there's about another 10 standards that you can go into with ISO that have almost anything that you could ever want about business continuity planning, ITDR, IT risk management, document control around everything, ISO 9001, all those different items on there. That's a great place for ISO. But watch out, some of those base standards on there, and they're intended to do this, are highly referential. In other words, if I go into ISO 22301 and I look for a BIA, I'm not going to find that in there. If I go into 22317, that's what it's all about. Their supply chain, all those different items out there. The FFIEC BCP work program. The biggest thing about that, that was always our gold standard. So if there was one standard that a lot of people used, this was the best kept secret outside of the financial services industry. There was a ton in here about business operations and about BIA and about business recovery. And then as a special gift, they added on Appendix J for third-party vendor risk management on here. So that's all. When I talk about look at your vendors' plans and your vendors' plans, that is a big topic of conversation. We actually, at the last DRJ conference, we had an hour-long webinar, or excuse me, seminar on regulations, and that was a huge part of that and how to comply with that. So third-party vendor management is it's just a massive topic right now. There's a lot of information up on our site about that, or you can go on to the FFIEC site, and you can actually download that for free. So that's a good one. Our friends at the DRI and the BCI, the professional practices, good practice guidelines on there. There's a lot of information on that. Those used to just be like basic frameworks, but they've added on a lot of content on there too, and there's a lot of supplementary materials on that too. NFPA 1600, the National Fire Protection Association. That was really hot a long time ago. We still utilize that today. Has a lot of good lists of hazards in there and risks. There's about 70 of those in there. Crisis management, it's big on that. So if you're looking for IT or more of the business continuity stuff, a little lighter on that, but awesome on all of those other standards, all of those other requirements around that crisis management and emergency facilities. And actually NFPA has an entire series. It's on fire protection and on facilities and building standards, kind of a corollary to what we do. But I've always found it's very interesting when you can talk with a facilities manager and you bring up NFPA 1600, and you can also talk about that too. HIPAA, that has actually gone into more of that, the CMS emergency preparedness rule on there, all around healthcare. A lot of organizations that didn't really necessarily have to, and I say have to, comply before with some of those standards. It was a little looser. This has brought it to the forefront of healthcare organizations, the payers, the hospitals, the clinics, all of those other items on there. Very long rule. They actually even considered a 48-hour recovery requirement, a mandatory recovery requirement in there. That was highly debated in the proposed rule on there. So not in there right now, although some people may argue on that. I've heard them argue on that before. So big on healthcare on there. GTAG was the standard that surprised us before on there. The GTAG, and you can also look to ISACA on there. What are the auditors using? What is your Big Four practices and your external auditors and internal auditors using? They may be referencing that, so that you have to look to. NIST, the Special Publication 800-34, and actually really a lot of that 800 series covers technology and other topics around tech and other items within disaster recovery, a bit on IT risk management on there, and business continuity. Your different utilities, you have your NERC, your FERC standards. Here was an interesting one that popped up. We did dam safety before. Very strange, you know. This is an example of something, another one that can really surprise you. And you said, what exactly is that? It's like, this drives our entire program. And there were a lot of requirements in there that you wouldn't typically see in any of these other items on there. COBIT and COSO, once again, guiding a lot of those auditors on there too, and a lot of the risk management. And there's a ton of other risk management standards. I didn't list a lot of those here. But as you can see, there's a lot out there. It's tough to remember them all too, but if you ever want to see any of the, you know, what exactly does this mean? Could this be appropriate to me? The DRJ, DRI, BCI, we have a list on our site under the BCP Genome, which I'll provide a link to you, and we provide little blurbs about what each of the standards are on there that we've included in the genome. That's a big, that could be very helpful for you. Okay. So as I mentioned before, don't jump on the hot standard. So I remember I was on the NFPA 1600 traveling roadshow talking about that. We started out with about 500 people, I remember, in Atlantic City, and that dwindled down to about a half a dozen people at Baltimore, Maryland, a number of years ago. And then we said, oh no, now we've got BS 25999 on here. We had PS Prep, ISO 22301 now, and it was like following the bouncing ball. The problem with just following one standard is that if you follow this, it goes, oop, that might have changed, and you're also missing a lot of the content where one standard best practice or reg may do very, very well and another may not do very well. So the lesson learned on there is that don't single thread your gold standard by only using one. Use a combination. All right, lesson number 3, don't get overwhelmed. As I mentioned before, you don't need all of them on here. You know, there's, like I said, today, you know, you'll learn about, you've learned about some of the standards and best practices and regs that are good for you, and there's a lot of information on our site and other sites that'll point you in the right direction, and you actually can always ask us too. So you don't need all of them. Start with the ones that you have to comply with, put the points into your gold standard, fill the holes with the other one. Basic steps on there of how to do that. So let's talk about which ones are the best for each of the different areas on there. Okay. So here's my ugly chart on here. All right. So I didn't put all 30 of them on there because I just simply can't put 30 across a slide. But what I wanted to do was I just wanted to pick some of the core ones on there. I wanted to pick like ISO. I wanted to show you an example of a standard that doesn't have much meat in it, like HIPAA on there. I wanted to show you one that was good, like FFIEC. I wanted to show you ones that were good in different areas. So the first thing I want to go on into is I want to show you the ISO 22301 on here. So you can see on here a lot of that bread, awesome, on doing organization management and training, maintenance, general policy. You can see what I've listed here are the number of points. So you can see the 101 points total for that on here, and then how many were in each of the areas. So you can see like BIA had 9, emergency response and crisis management 31. Here was 12. So you see here 1 out of 12, 5 out of 16, business and support component recovery. So like, very, like I said, very referential on here. And, you might want to go into 22.317. The companion standard to 22.301 is 22.313, and that actually has quite a bit of content in there. FFIEC is particularly good at a lot of these other areas on here. You can see BIA, there's only 9 different points on here. That's actually kind of a weak point with a lot of these different areas, and even 22.317, it's got a lot of what. How you're doing it, it has some of that on there too. And I think that's obviously going to continue to evolve, but as it stands right now, you can see not a lot on that. But you can see FFIEC, business and support component recovery, really good. Exercise, testing, good. Emergency facilities, good. NFPA 1600, organization management and training. Crisis management, risk management, those list of hazards. There's, like I said, about 70 of those, anything that could possibly happen to an organization, from fire and flooding to different types of attacks to all different kinds of hazards. That's in there. Really good with that. And you can see on some of the other areas where those are good. I have a full crosswalk if anybody's interested in finding out more about maybe there's some other standards for their industry or things like that. But the point on this is that you could do very well combining together ISO to start your program on there, kind of coming up with some of your own BIA stuff, NFPA 1600 and FFIEC, and maybe supplementing that with some stuff if you're looking for ITDR in those NIST. And obviously that doesn't consider your own industries. The utilities industry would definitely obviously look to like NERC and FERC, those different organizations for their requirements in there. Okay. So as I mentioned before, prepare for convergence. So the convergence that I'm talking about is business continuity management and risk management. One of the biggest things that we've seen on here is that there's a lot of similarities. Like we talk BIAs and business continuity. We talk about risk assessments, business operations, controls, assess effectiveness, up in risk management. So there's a lot of items that don't appear in those business continuity standards on there. And you need to look and really supplement from those other standards like the COSO and the COBID and the different ISO standards on there to really have that effective framework, that effective gold standard for yourself on there. I'm not going to talk a ton about that today as we're finishing up here, but if anybody's interested in that, we have entire webinars and presentations exactly on this, on how to utilize those different standards to assist with your framework, with your frameworks, your gold standards, and your programs too. Okay. So as I mentioned before, some of the options, the sources of information on there, so industry associations like the ACP and the BCI and the DRI and companies like us, like Strategic BCP, have lists of regulations, standards, and best practices right on their website. That used to be really, there wasn't a lot of that available a couple of years ago, but there is a plethora of that right now. Another really important point too, some, not all of the standards can be downloaded for free. So like that FFIEC BCP work program, and there's a lot of other work programs on there too around security, but really a lot of different IT items on there, and around some of the ones that may not apply are around financial systems or compliance around for financial institutions. But a lot of those different items, that's a great resource to download, that FFIEC website on there has a lot of that. The ISO standards generally you're going to have to pay for, and you can download. Typically those are, I've seen anywhere from like 50 up to, be a couple $100 on there. Internally in my organization, in Strategic BCP, we have industry compliance roundtables and LinkedIn groups. So there's LinkedIn groups specifically established for financial services and for healthcare. So we have activity that's around a lot of topics like this, like how are you dealing with Appendix J? How are you dealing with that new CMS standard on there? And then we get some more of the, if you're looking for what do people think about ISO 22301, there's a lot of that on sites like the Business Continuity Institute, DRI, a lot of the different organizations are also going out and providing some studies around that, or people actually using that, which is particularly interesting. So if you do a search, you can find a lot of that. Just very briefly about our company. We do audits with our genome where we can come in and examine your program versus the different points in the genome. So if you're interested and you say, hey, look, thank you for showing me how to build our gold standard, but I'm more curious about what you've done and you want something right out of the box, we use that in our audit. As I mentioned before, our software has that built in. So as we're filling out our different screens, the different fields in Resilience 1, we're actually guaranteeing that compliance, conformance, and alignment with all the reg standards and best practices. We're singular in the industry in doing that. And another service that we started to offer too, you can see up here, the little logo that we've had throughout the entire presentation is audit protection. So, and it's an important program that we found to be extremely beneficial to organizations that want to guarantee compliance on there. And we use that genome. And so we've had organizations, clients that have come to us and said, you know what, I have examiners in here. I don't know what to tell them. I don't know what to do. And we come on in and we help you. So we assist you in being audit ready. So not just resilient, but in being audit ready to pass any of those different standards, regs, or best practices that they can throw at you, even the surprising ones too. Okay. So this is the final slide, and I have a questions bar on here. And I'm going to take a look at that in a sec and try to answer as many questions in the last 10 minutes that we have here. Here's some important web links on here too if you want to learn about what we offer. As promised, if you go to strategicbcp.com on here, you can also, whoop, one sec here. Go back to that. Sorry about that. You can also see the different, about the BCP genome and the 30 different items that are included in that, also with the description of what those are. If you're interested in getting a demonstration of how Resilience 1 works with the genome, you can come on strategicbcp.com and request that. Here's a little on, you can read that, on Gartner, the system. And if you want to ask me a direct question, there's my email. You can also email fperlmutter@strategicbcp.com, though I still get challenged spelling my last name too, so I provided you my alias there with Frank. Okay, so I'm going to take let me just look at what we provided here. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So okay. So the first question on here. Let me see if I can expand out that. My window is only showing me one question at a time here. Let me see if I can expand this. One sec here. There we go. All right. So what about establishing a gold standard if you have certifications that guide you towards other standards not listed in your crosswalking standards? Absolutely. Yeah, that's not. So if you start out and you're building and you say, oh my gosh, now I have these certifications that I need to do on there, absolutely include those. Those are really important. So you might have those certifications as just a normal course of business. Your auditors may ask you for those, or your clients may say, hey, look, you have to do this. That, as I mentioned earlier, that NIST 800-34 standard, collection companies had no idea what that was when the federal government said you need to use those. You need to comply with that. So that was a really important item on there. Okay, let's see what else we have on here. Okay. Fortunately, my screen is really small here. Will the session slides be available following this meeting? Yes, they will be, and I believe the webinar will also be available too. I think when Jim hops back on, he can talk about that, and you can also directly request those from Strategic BCP too. So if you want to email me directly, or if you want to email the sales folks, they also have copies of that too. That's sales@strategicbcp.com. Okay, what are your thoughts of doing an assessment for maturity level versus an audit pass and fail? I like that idea. See, that's good. If you have a program that's been really, it's been thoroughly developed, you feel that you have that level of maturity, that's a really good idea. Like I said, over the past 10 years, not a lot of these standards have really, and the points have drastically changed on there. So what do? You have different levels of competence or maturity in each of those different areas. So one of the things that I see that's kind of neat around risk management too is people say, say you have 100 business functions and you can recover 30 of those right now and it requires 18 systems to do so. What they do is they increase their recovery capabilities on there too. So their program becomes better at recovery. We're mitigating more risk. So that's something that we've seen lately too on there, and you can put that in your particular standard. So that's a great idea. So not just here's what I need to do, but what's an A, what's a B, what's a C, what's a D, and what's an F on there. Let's see. Okay, if you are in an organization that has security and BCDR in one business unit, how do you manage which standard would serve both units? See, that's the trick right there. I don't think that there's one standard that necessarily would serve both units at the same time on there. That's where you're going to want to take that combination of the best of business continuity and the best of that DR on there. It would be interesting to see too. I always used to ask my auditors and my clients do this too, and they say, hey, can I see a copy of what you're using to assess me or audit me or look at me? Like what exactly am I being evaluated on? And I would go and grab that, and you can get that from those business units too. It's like, what do you think? In the way that I'm supporting you, what's important to you? What would you consider to be that level of service that I'm providing? And take the different points from those standards that are really reflecting that emphasis on there. So if they say, hey, look, I want to show, a world-class recovery program, like business recovery program, and you go, wow, that's that FFIC BCP work program. I love that. They have great stuff on how to write up recovery procedures. That's what I would do. So it's most likely a combination of those different standards on there. That's a great example of that. Okay, let's see.
Well, Frank, at this point, I think we're getting close to the top of the hour. Yes, we are. So
okay, that's what I figured. All right,
jump in here right here, and let me just let everybody know that Frank will be given all of the questions that have come in and have not yet been answered, and he will provide answers for you, and you'll get an email with hopefully everything you need to know. I'm sure you will. So first, Frank, thank you so much for being with us today. It was a very very informative program, and we certainly appreciate you taking the time to join us and to present to all of the BC professionals in our audience here today. Certainly want to thank all of you who joined us for being with us, and I ask that you please stay on the line for just a quick minute. There's some more information coming up. First of all, be sure to watch the ACP website for future webinar information, and if you joined late today, a reminder that the program was recorded and will be made available to ACP members on the website a little bit later today. Finally, a very brief survey about the webinar will pop up. When you close your browser, we ask you just take a half a minute or so and ask the questions, because it really does help us out and help us hear from you and find out how we can continue to provide the things that serve you best in your workplace. So with that, I'm Jim Brennan. Thank you so much again for joining us. I wish you all a great rest of the day, and we'll talk to you next time.